Okay, I think we are a minute over the full hour, actually, too, so we can get started. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup Group. My name is Morten Elvang. And Dave, it's a real pleasure to have you back, this time to talk about weavering risk and strategy, which is the newest framework addition to the Cynefin family. So
Okay.
let's just do it the normal way with 30 minutes for you and then 30 minutes for conversation, and we'll try to keep the time. That's
Yeah.
it. Welcome.
Cool. Okay, so I'm not giving you slides. Yeah. I'll share a picture in a minute, which you're welcome to use. Yeah. So this has been a sort of 15-year program. Cynefin was never a strategy framework. It was a decision framework, and it's important to realize that. So it was a decision framework which uses complexity or references complexity, and complexity came to Cynefin after it had been created. It actually started off as a knowledge management community framework, right, in terms of the way it developed from working from WRASS as iSpace. S-Stream mapping, when that came out, was the first real complexity framework, and WRAS continues in that theme. Right? It also continues with the general theme we've had for 25 years now, which is called bounded applicability, is that we're trying to get rid of the fad cycle in consultancy. And instead of saying this now replaces everything which went before, it basically says everything which went before probably has value, but now we can either do it better or can do it differently, or we can do things around it. Yeah. And by the way, that's always been my position on systems thinking. I was heavily involved in systems thinking 30 years ago. It's just the science has moved on. It's not that it was wrong, it was right at the time, but we now know a lot more. Yeah. So I want to do some preliminary stuff up front before I introduce it. One is there's a key concept which comes out of physics, which we're increasingly using, which is the concept of a substrate. Now, we're avoiding the sort of idea of an environment. Substrate carries with it the idea of what's afforded to you within the environment. So it carries an affordance concept in it. And managing the substrate is one of the sort of key issues on how we manage complexity. There was a good article which came out this morning, which Morten and I were talking about earlier, by an academic, which is actually one of the first major complexity strategy articles I've seen. I agree and disagree with it, and I'm recovering from being described as one of the classical approaches. All right, I didn't think I was a classical approach, but never mind. These things come to you with age. All right. Either way, the fascinating thing about that is it's the first paper I've seen which is finally catching up with what some of us have been saying for ages, is that it's all about energy gradients. Yeah, it's not about mechanical metaphors. It's not about purpose. It's not about, it's not about any of that. It's about what's afforded to you by the energy gradients in the environment and how do you change those energy gradients. And in more simple terms, complexity has always been about where am I, what can I do next, rather than what I would like to achieve and how do I close the gap. And that comes from the fact that in a complex system, there isn't any linear causality. So defining a future state is an error anyway, although you may have a sense of direction. And by the way, it always upsets me. People keep talking about the North Star as if it was a destination. The North Star is a navigation aid, and if they could realize that, it might make life a lot easier all round. Yeah. So substrate management is key. And in the blog post I hope to have up for this session, but it now won't go up until tomorrow, we're now talking about the technological substrate, the cultural substrate, the procedural substrate, and the network substrate. So we're starting to produce a typology to get people to focus on that. And the overall argument is that you get the environment right, so the energy cost of good things is less than the energy cost of bad things. If you want a really simple statement about what complexity-based strategy is, it's about managing the energy gradients so that the thing is more likely to evolve in the right direction, and creating network sensors that allow you to spot weak signals in a way that you wouldn't otherwise do. Right? So it's fast response, exploit opportunities, but influence the direction of travel by changing the energy gradients. And that's what S-Stream mapping really focused on. And remember, S-Stream mapping had that key question, break things down until you agree. All right, so we're trying to get an objective approach to situational assessment, and you can't have that if people are thinking about what you do next. So we're definitely separating situation from action. And you'll see that in the WRAS framework as well. Right? So separate processes, you can't combine the two. The other thing to bring in on this is Pagoda, if you haven't seen that. So this is an acronym. It describes the characteristics of the way you manage a complex system. So Pagoda stands for proximity. Proximity matters in a complex system. If you look in a bee swarm, you're looking at an ant's nest, you're looking at antelope, the system is responding to things which are adjacent, not things which are distant. And generally, human beings will respond to proximate threat, but not distant threat. If you look at it, people responded to lockdown in COVID, but they're not prepared to make the sacrifices for climate change, and even though that's a more severe threat. So proximity matters, and I'll come back to that when I talk about Swarm Compass, because basically, if you look at all animal behavior, it optimizes by hyperlocal interactions with no directing intelligence. Yeah, and that's something we can learn from. Optimization happens because of hyperlocal multiple interactions at scale. And I'll talk about that in terms of swarming. So proximity matters, all right? I've got to try and remember them all now. So A is abductive. Yeah. No, so A is anomaly. Right, get my A's right. Human beings only respond to anomalies. So if you remember the classic case of people not seeing the gorilla in the X-ray, it's because they're not expecting to see a gorilla, so they don't see it. If I may, yeah, and some of our work, for example, with executives, if we present them with stories indexed by employees, then get them to index them the way they think the employees index them, and we show them the difference. That's much more effective as a change mechanism than telling them they should listen to their employees. Because what we do is we create an anomaly, and in cognitive neuroscience terms, anomalies excite what's called the novelty receptive processing in the brain rather than autonomic processing. And that only comes in when we get anomalies. So creating anomalies is key. It will be an interesting thing tomorrow. I'm going to make this point that if you don't have debate, you don't get anomalies, so you don't get progress. That may or may not go down well, but we shall see tomorrow, right? G is granularity. That's going to be key to WRAS, right? Finer grained things will combine and recombine in novel ways. Coarse grained things won't. So a complex system scales by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation or repetition. So if you work with very fine grained things, you can get completely novel combinations. As a sidebar on this, that's part of our narrative work as well. If you have a narrative assemblage, i.e. a strange attractor, a pattern of belief, you don't counter it by arguing against it logically. You argue against it by breaking it down and recombining it. That's our work, for example, on politics, is going down to micro stories captured by children and then allow them to recombine in a different context rather than trying to deal with the sort of negative political higher level assemblage. But that's a sidebar, right? So granularity counts. O is obliquity. Working indirectly is far more successful than working directly. The minute you work directly on a problem, you get gaming behavior. Right? So people work out very fast. It's my old thing about the tyranny of the explicit, or anything explicit will always be gamed. Right? And I can give you loads of examples from IBM on that. So, and there's a wonderful book, by the way, called Obliquity, which I recommend. It links in with acceptation in biology. It shows how often we solve problems when we don't try and solve the problem directly, but we work around it. And in a complex system, that has a scientific basis to it. It's not just evidential in terms of what works. Yeah. D is disintermediation. You have to remove any interpretive layer between the decision maker and the raw data. Because every interpretive data filters out material which may be relevant at a different level. That's one of these really big differences. All right, it's one of our real issues, by the way, with AI, is AI is aggregating too quickly. All right, it's an aggregating based on probability, so it's basically ignoring stuff in the tail of a Pareto distribution, which is key. And then finally, A is for abduction. Abduction is what human beings do. Induction is what AI does. So human beings evolved to make decisions without training data sets. Aesthetics is key to human decision making. It allows us to handle total ambiguity. yeah, in radically different ways. Right? And I did use AI to create Pagoda, by the way, because I had another word, fractal, i.e., any decision making in a complex system has to be fractal, so things need to be self-similar at different levels. So I asked DeepSeek, which is my AI of choice. I like DeepSeek, right? It sort of thinks a little bit like me. I said, give me a word with all of those letters, and it couldn't. Or it made up a word because it wanted to please me, but it didn't exist. So I said, you can drop one letter, and it came up with pagoda. And of course, a pagoda is fractal. So that's kind of like perfect, right? In terms of its structure, right? So that's kind of like there. Now, the way WRAS works is if it builds off two things. First of all, it builds off granularity. So the horizontal dimension of WRAS goes from finely grained commitment of resource to coarsely grained commitment of resource. And generally, the assumption is with finely grained commitment, I can do more in parallel and I can afford more failure. Whereas with coarsely grained commitment of resource, I can't afford for something to fail. And by the way, this is fun in government. If you ever do a big government contract, you'll always get paid because governments can't say that any project failed. Too much reputation is at stake, right? I mean, you learn that one pretty fast, right? So the horizontal dimension of WRAS, yeah, and I'll post a picture in a minute, but I just want to describe the big picture first, is finely grained and by implication multiple interventions, all right? And the right-hand side is coarse-grained interventions. And by the way, this is all designed to pass the back of a table napkin test. We're keeping that. If you can't draw it from memory on the back of a table napkin, it has no utility. And that's the core principle of what we do. The vertical dimension links to emergence, and this is the key phenomenon in complexity. Emergence, you can't predict what patterns will emerge. Right? That's why in complexity, we don't set goals and we don't have outcome-based targets because the system is inherently uncertain. As things interact with other things, patterns will emerge from that interaction. Now, having said that, and I'm blogging about this later on this week, there are regularities in emergence which we can rely on. Right? I'll be doing a lot more on this. So identifying what the regularities are in multiple patterns is key. And by the way, Johan, this is key on the sort of warfare front. Yeah, in terms of commander's intent and enemy intent, what I remember, right? So the fact that regularities emerge, so all termites nest have a common structure, even though they're all different. That would be a good way of illustrating that. All right. So emergence is not just about everything is uncertain. I don't have to do anything. Emergence is actually a scientific phenomenon. So on the vertical dimension, we contrast at the bottom the sort of famous 70s things about just let everything happen. We're talking about that as natural emergence. So things will happen as markets develop, as people interact, as people exchange goods, as they buy things, as people do things. All of that is natural emergence. I'm going to see what happens and respond to it. On the vertical dimension, I'm going to try and force emergence, and I'm not sure that's the right phrase. We're still playing with the language on this. So I might want to do market research. I can't afford to wait for things to happen. I have to find ways to understand what happens. Right? So that's my simple cross, right? So on the vertical dimension, from the bottom, waiting for things to happen, responding. On the top, doing things to find out what the limits are of what could happen or to find out what should happen. Right? And on the horizontal dimension, on the left-hand side, finely grained multiple interventions where I can afford a high rate of failure. And on the right, yeah, coarse-grained interventions where I can't really afford to do that. So that's the basic picture. Right? Now, that gives me 4 different principal domains. So the northwest domain, which is stimulated or forced emergence and coarse-grained intervention, is traditional strategy.
Dave, so you wanted to share the image?
Yeah, I'm going to describe it first, then share it.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, I just want to get through just hold this in your mind, all right? So if I have stimulated or forced emergence combined with massive investment, that's traditional strategy. I have to do market research, and we call that directed. All right, I'm going to direct the system, and that's where traditional strategy sits. We have no problem with that. Bottom right is opportunistic. So this is massive investment, but I wait for things to happen. So this is kind of like entrepreneurs. It's an open market. You see something, you see the thing, and you bet the ranch on it. Right? So that's opportunistic. In companies, that's intrapreneurship, which is not the same thing as entrepreneurship. That's Max Worth at Wharton. Right? So I'm not going to go into that, but that's something which will develop around that part of the framework. Yeah, markets act entrepreneurially, so they have high rates of failure, but people bet the ranch. You can't do that in a company. So if you're going to be opportunistic, you've got to focus what's on called intrapreneurship. Right? So that's a field in that area. Then top left, so this is stimulated emergence and finely grained interventional. This is traditional Cynefin. So in Cynefin, in the complex domain, you identify every coherent hypothesis, and every coherent hypothesis gets investment to see what will work. So I'm doing small things in parallel, but I'm testing for coherence. So what I'm doing is I'm allowing people to generate ideas. I'm testing the ideas for coherence. If the idea is coherent, we run with it, but we run with them in parallel and we see what happens. Yeah? So I can afford some failure, but that's there. Bottom left is where it gets really interesting. This is the area where we plan a lot more announcements over the next few weeks. This is where I'm going to do lots of fine-grained interventions, but I'm going to let things happen naturally. Now, this area is really important because even within Cynefin complex, what is coherent, will be defined by established practice to some extent. So if you go into a senior executive with a completely left field idea, it will probably get dismissed as coherent, even if you can justify it. All right? So this changes that domain. And then in each of those domains, we have a risk reduction strategy. All right, so Mass Sense, or the new version, which is Swarm Compass. So just to tell you how Swarm Compass works, and I'll put the brochure in the chat area in a second. Swarm Compass mimics the swarming behavior of bees, in which individual bees leave the swarm, find a new location for their hive, come back to the swarm, and do a figure-of-8 dance on the swarm. Yeah, and the plane of the figure-of-8, that angle to the sun, indicates the direction, and the intensity of the dance indicates how good the source is. And there are bees which disrupt the dance of other bees. Now, this is a key point on complexity as opposed to a lot of AI. Yeah, ambiguity is critical for emergence. You can't remove ambiguity in language or anything else because then you get no novelty, you get no variation. And then after 2 to 3 days, the entire swarm gets up and goes to a location, and it's always the best location of all the ones they've investigated. If anybody wants the papers on this, I've published a book chapter on this, which has got all the references. So what we're now doing in companies, and we've made our first 2 sales, and it's now open, is to present an issue to the entire workforce. They all interpret it, and then we present and represent the results over a very limited period of time. So take an outlier view, represent it to the majority, see if it's something they've missed or it's something they want to dismiss. And then very quickly, we emerge with a consensus position and with distinct outlier positions. So that allows a company to do in a day what, for example, Open Strategy would do in employee engagement over 3 months. Right? And that's been set up as a service that organizations can run. And I'm having discussions here next week because we actually could run that over a whole nation. Right? If we got the citizens in a sensor network, in a response network, we're going backwards and forwards with deliberate ambiguity to see what's possible. And that changes the way we consult. So that's another quite exciting thing which works in various spaces. But you mitigate the risk of strategy by finding outliers or dissenting views before you commit your resources. Right, so that's the risk mitigation there. The risk mitigation in the opportunist domain is all about creating human sensor networks. This is in the EU field guide. It's a key aspect of resilience. You need your employees continuously scanning and feeding back data at scale, not just when you choose to consult them. Because that way you'll spot the opportunities, and that's the work we've been doing with engineering and elsewhere. Cynefin, the domain, the hypothesis domain, well, the risk mitigation strategy there is to open up the hypotheses, run them in parallel, Make sure you always have a maverick opinion. Make sure you always have an oblique intervention. So there's some heuristics which can reduce the risk. The really exciting thing in the bottom left, and this is where we're going to be announcing a whole new method shortly. And this builds in two simple facts. One is what's called Panopticon effect. So in Panopticon effect, this is, you know there's an observer, but you don't know who the observer is. Right? Now, this introduces honesty in a way that other audit controls don't. Right? I'm sharing the WRAS framework now. Yeah. And also, we're working with natural sizes. So, and if you want the references on this, you can have them. Human beings didn't evolve to make decisions as individuals. We really make decisions in sexual pairs. That's primary nurture. In extended family, small hunting groups, which never have more than 7 active decision makers. In what are called deems, which are enlarged hunting groups, so collective families, which tend to compete with other deems, never more than about 20, 30. And then what are called macro deems, which is where the deems come together in winter because they've got to cooperate to survive. And if you look at Gerber's work, we think that's where monument building came from. People won't cooperate because you get them in a workshop and say they should think differently about life and be nice to each other. That doesn't work. But if you make them build Stonehenge, they'll cooperate. Yeah? So it's quite interesting that because we now think it was like capitalism in the summer and socialism in the winter, if you look at Neolithic times. Yeah, and that actually has some implications for modern society, but when you cooperate and when you don't. Either way, so we're working with Panopticon effect and the not more than 7 agents. And I'm just going to outline this now. So we identify, for example, 4 roles. And if you can assemble a team with those 4 roles and you accept a 5th role, which is fully anonymous. So it could be a person, it could be a committee, it could be changed, it could be an AI agent. You don't know who it is. And you document context, decision, and consequence, and we'll have software for that. Then you can spend $10,000, $1,000 without asking for permission. No? Now, this actually costs a lot less money for a company than a normal authorization process, and it allows genuinely maverick ideas to possibly come through. It's actually based on the Grameen Bank. I spent Mohammed Yunus' time on this one. Yeah? And that's also of interest to the Development Bank. So the basic WRAS framework basically says, look, we got these, and it's designed to be easier for people to understand. So it is a 2x2 matrix. Yeah, no problem with those in context. It has risk mitigation strategies, and rather ironically, the double cross is a symbol for chaos. So that's kind of like an accident. I'd like to pretend I planned it, but I didn't. All right. The apparatic domain here now comes on the outside, not the center. And the reason it does that is you shouldn't take any of these to excess. So when this gets published, you'll see there are different portfolios. So any company is going to have likely a spider diagram in the middle of that thing. Yeah? I'm trying to think if I've got one here. If not, I'll find it during questions. So we're building standard profiles of different types of company and different types of industry. So some might be biased towards top right, some to bottom left, etc. But the argument is you should probably have investment in all 4 quadrants. And if you go to the extreme in commitment, you should probably get apparatic and start to reorientate. So that's the reason that's around the side. And as you can see, the complex ordered domain effectively can be overlaid on that. Yeah. So that's WRAS. Yeah. Now, as I say, we're developing more on this. There's going to be lots of publications. It links in with S-Trime mapping very clearly. Yeah. S-Trime mapping is about the environment. Yeah. Cynefin is about what type of decisions you make. Pigod is about how you intervene and so on. So these frameworks are coming together, and I am going to create a new, people may remember I produced a big scary diagram a few years ago. I'm going to update that with a new, hopefully less scary diagram, which shows how these integrate. What we're building to with both software and method is a 3 to 6 month strategy cycle that companies can go through. Yeah. And that's going to be available to our network. Strategically, by the way, we're trying to be a research group, not a consultancy group. So we see our role as creating methods and tools that other people pick up and use and combine with other techniques. There'll be big new announcements on virtual Hexi next month as well. There's a lot been going on. So that's kind of like the big picture. The other thing I'll share with you now is the Swarm Compass brochure. This is us trying to get a bit more commercial because the market's changed, and we're open to deals on that at the moment. And I'll also share the Radical New program, which has just gone out, where we're looking at what the balance is between AI and human reasoning and how you maintain that balance, and also identifying tasks and companies that technology can do better than humans, but if humans don't do them, they never develop higher capacity, right? So that's a new program which is going to run over the next 18 months, and that will generate a whole bunch of new methods. So I said I'd keep it to half an hour. I've kept it to half an hour. That's kind of like RAS. Oh, and by the way, it's now going to be WRASSE. Yeah, because everybody started to pronounce it that way anyway. And the RAS is a really interesting little fish. All right. So, and it's very colorful and it gives me lots of artwork I can use. And I'll cut and paste the argument for why we're using RAS into the chat area now.
Then you need a fishing net instead of a spider web.
Well, it's a fishing metaphor. RASes work in 3 dimensions. They're actually highly adaptive. All right. They're a really fascinating species. Yeah? And it fits in with the navigation metaphors, yeah. So estuarine, all of that starts to come together. Yeah. And any jokes
Thank
about
you.
we're all at sea, feel free to go for them. I've had enough of those already. So yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Well, let me just open with one question. So imagine that you're a large enterprise and you're struggling a little bit with strategy, and you heard about RIS and thought, I want one of those things. So what's the process of acquiring it and getting it installed on the hard disk so you can run with it?
Okay, so we're currently building the methods at the moment. I'm chatting with Patrick because I want to take his patterns of strategy. I'm trying to be nice to systems thinkers at the moment because I think we can use some of their stuff. Patterns of Strategy is one of my favorite books, and Patrick always gets upset when I compliment it. But what we're going to do is to create facilitation kits. So, for example, take each pattern, and so people can use RAS to identify what they're currently doing or where they think they fit. I'm taking the Chinese warfare, the 16 factors. So we're going to have a series of facilitation aids produced, and we're going to do what we did with butterfly stamping on Cynefin, if you remember that. People will start to play with the model using existing examples until they understand it. Then they'll apply it to themselves. Yeah, there will be Swarm Compass cells in its own right, but there will be versions of SenseMaker which will populate the framework. We're about to launch the one for estuarine, which you can run over the whole workforce. Yeah. And we are defining it in relationship to other strategy frameworks. As you can see, RAS is defined to say other strategy can fit into this. Yeah.
Then last question from me, and then let's open it up. Is it also the idea that you can use RAS for measuring your risk position?
Yeah, and I
Is it
think what
something you
we're
can?
saying is, and sorry, I didn't make that clear. We're weaving risk and strategy together. You say we don't do a linear strategy, then assess the risk. What we do is actually our strategy, risk and strategy are deeply entangled, and that's what the framework does. Yeah. So you'll see more stuff around that in the facilitation kits.
Okay, let's open it up.
They're all going very quiet.
I can go. First, a question regarding granularity. You said we break things down until we agree. And I have a hard time to grasp that because I think we abstract up until we have a common denominator. Then we tend to disagree when we go into details. Can you
No,
explain that a bit
it's the
more?
other way around. If you abstract, you end up with something that nobody can disagree with but is meaningless.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, that's what I call the platitude path.
okay.
If you break it down until you agree, and we've never had a problem with this, people add contextual statements. Yeah, and that's really important because context is key to complexity. You say, well, in this case, it would be here. In that case, it would be there. In this case, it would be this. Yeah,
Yeah, I see.
that's what we're
And
doing.
there, then I would, because of the picture I got now listening to you, I associated this x-axis to Christopher Alexander and his design thinking about form, function, fit. And in some way, on the abstracted level, coarse-grained, there you have some functional aspiration. And when you go to fine-grained, you realize it in some kind of form. And I guess the fit will be the place where you end.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the reasons I want to use Patrick's stuff is he's the modern inheritor of Alexander's pattern language, all right? But I think he's too coarsely grained.
Okay.
So patterns of strategy sort of sits in the middle of this. Yeah. So I've been trying for ages to get him to agree for us to break each of those patterns down into smaller units and put them into a narrative database. And I may get there. I may just do it, to be honest. All right. So yes, we are, and the pattern language is one of the aspects of systems thinking which carries over into complexity theory if you get the granularity right.
Yeah. And just the last question for me to understand. So understanding Christopher Alexander's language, would you be able to see that the fit will be where you end up with a right strategy, a right product, whatever it is, and you don't know in pre-hand where you will end up. But that's the travel against the North Star, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's also where you start to say where we start to do assemblies as well as assemblages. So what we're doing on the facilitation kit for this, which is virtual, and this is Hexi, all right? You will have an assembly, which is a combination of methods, tools, factors, which actually that's a recipe. You can call the recipe onto the screen, but then you can break it apart and change things. So you can change sugar for honey, right? So the concept of an assembly, which is a regularity, yeah, gives us more structure and stability and is another way of reducing risk. And I can, by the way, we will create in a market by which independent consultants can create their own assemblies, which they can sell. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
But
I have a question because you've started from systems thinking and saying that the actual research world moved on beyond it. But what I can observe on, let's say, organizational level is that companies haven't still yet adopted systems thinking in the first place. And then with the years that are coming, more and more models and tools and frameworks appear, which have higher and higher entry cost for the company to understand it, go through the notions and so on, and actually have it implemented. So the question would be, do we actually need more nuanced frameworks if we haven't done the basics in the first place?
First of all, I don't think systems thinking is a necessary precursor to complexity science. Yeah, I think systems thinking has had 50 years. All right. And it's never actually made the breakthroughs it said it would have. And one of the reasons is it's based on a restrictive view of information. It goes back to Ashby and Shannon. Yeah. And it never passes the back of a table napkin test. Have you ever tried to explain VSM to anybody without a degree in the subject? Right. So systems thinking hasn't taken off on the strategic front. We're focusing our marketing around this, around VUCA, Barney, etc. You don't need those very complicated solutions with all those difficult diagrams and all those very, strategy is actually really simple. It's your gardening metaphor is if you've got a garden which is a paddy field, you can't grow cacti. So drain it before you do anything else. Manage the substrate, manage the direction of travel, increase the agency. We want to keep it really simple. I think systems thinking, remember I was heavily involved in it 30 years ago with Frank Land, etc. Was a great idea at the time. It's like single and double loop learning. It was a brilliant idea when Argyris came out with it, but we now know that's not how it works. That's how science happens. It progresses. Yeah. So the real chance for companies is to jump. But the other thing I will say, this is market life cycle theory. We've been selling theory for the last 10, 20 years. I'm chatting a lot about this with Simon Wardley. That's how long it takes for something to really change, right? Now we're into an early majority market. They buy solutions, but it's 13.5% of the market. So don't expect this to sell to very traditional late adopters because it won't. This is targeted at early majority. It's got structure, it's got form, it's got pedigree. It can be understood, yeah, but it's not going to sell to people who want to play absolutely safe. They'll carry on employing McKinsey.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Yes, I might have one more on the practical side. Dave, you mentioned that you could go from a 3 months open strategy process to a 1 day. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Okay, so I mean, you wouldn't have the human interaction that you get in open strategy, but I really like the open strategy book. I buy the concept, but having to bet lots of consultants in and hold lots of workshops, you can never do the whole population of your employees anyway, and it takes a lot of time. So the way we're setting this up is there are several components, and we're also building sensor networks other than your employees. So I'm negotiating to have available an international network of journalists. I'm talking with universities to make their masters and PhD students available. So what happens is you define a problem, you choose a network, we present the problem to the network, we look at the responses, we iterate and iterate and iterate. We end up with a consensus, then we present the consensus for action, people come up with actions, and we test the validity. Now, at the moment, we can do that in 3 to 4 days. Once we complete the automation, which is what we're looking for investment on, and we increase the AI component of the iteration, which we're doing with the training data, we'll be able to replicate literally in an hour what currently takes 3 to 6 months in terms, and we'll be able to engage the whole of the workforce, or, and this is the really big thing, the whole of a country. Right? This is a radical alternative to citizen assemblies because it deals with sentiment and attitude, not precision. And it identifies where there is a feasible pathway, and it does it with the optimization mechanism of a swarm. Yeah. Any
Dave, do
more?
you have any questions for us?
No, not really. We're looking for feedback. All right. I'm going to put this stuff up on a blog shortly. All right. I need to I need to write the academic article and get it into a peer-reviewed journal. That's underway at the moment. All right. And we need to do some more definition. We're really interested, and several people helped on this, in defining current approaches to strategy against this, either to exclude them or to include them. Yeah.
Then,
And maybe a
so,
final question from me. What would be your measurement of success, like introducing this framework?
That when I look back on it on 10 years, as I've changed it as much as I changed Cynefin. Right, so remember the way we work is we don't start with cases, we start with theory. That takes 5 to 6 years. Then we move into experimental practice, which is where we are now, and then we stabilize it. Right? That took 15 years with Cynefin. Yeah, I don't buy the case-based approach, and I buy effectively emergence. So what we'll see is this will change and modify, the labels will modify. And one of the big things we're doing with SenseMaker, for a moment, the example is to use symbols, not text, for signification. And I had a wonderful conversation with somebody the other day, and I said, we're doing that. She said, oh my God, that's so much more rigorous than text. I thought, finally, somebody's got it. Yeah, they've got the role of abstraction in human sense making. Yeah, so that would be my idea. And I think, we're not going to dominate the space like Porter did, but this is really planned to be the Porter equivalent for Porter was for systems thinking, what this hopefully will be for complexity. But we are doing a lot of it in open source, and that's deliberate, which Porter didn't. Yeah, Johan?
Yeah, thank you. I can't say I'm grasping it yet, I guess what I'm missing, and maybe others are missing as well, is like with Cynefin, you have examples like good practice, best practice, emerging practice, or you had a strategy to make it more tangible. Now we only have those yellow text, and or for me at least, I need something more to understand what a Porter or the other could be a part of that, I guess.
You have to wait a bit. I mean, we didn't have that at the start on Cynefin either.
Okay.
You get that.
Looking forward to it then.
You put it out, you do it. Now we have got concrete examples in those 4 domains about what you would do. So there's a tool for each of those domains, right? And that will be further fleshed out in the documentation. And by the way, the tools also provide an entry into the space. The other thing which is important is the building the patterns. So the WRAS patterns, which I just should. No, I'll send that out to you later. So building the profiles. So effectively what we'll do is we'll work through strategy, say for Nokia, And we'll say this is the strategy that Nokia de facto adopted. They were all focused here. They didn't have enough there. Right? So the WRAS framework basically says you need to get balance right. Yeah. So we're comfortable about enough now to release it into the experimental stage, but we're not making any pretense it's where Cynefin was after 10 years. Yeah. Estrine, interestingly, has been the fastest adoption of anything I've ever done. That only took 2 years. Any more?
So maybe contextual question. So strategy has some neighboring topics. One is AI, the other one is organization. So on the AI, obviously there is a number of connections. So would like to hear what you think about that. And then also strategy needs to take place in an organization. So do you see anything changing to how we need to think about organization or any evolution there?
Yeah, and that's why I'm talking about different size groups. So I mean, as you know, we already do a lot of work to build informal networks to thread silos together. So we don't believe you can abolish silos. We think it's stupid to try and pretend you can, but we can link and connect them. So that's a de-risking strategy. All right, that fits in with that entangled trios. Swarm Compass is a massive de-risker. Yeah, because it allows executives to engage huge networks before they commit and do it really quickly, so they can take advantage of it. So that's another way in which we would do that. And I think what we'll actually see on this is the individual tools will be the entry sales point for people adopting it rather than the whole framework. Yeah. Organizational design. But look, let's say, I say, look, and by the way, we're looking at this on medical decisions. We know that we can take 50% of the admin cost of a hospital out and have medical decisions made instantly with better audit control than the current process. So we know we can do that. We've shown that working with a medical statistics group. And that's by distributing decision making into role combinations with Panopticon effect. Yeah. So I think what you're going to see is those individual things deal with intractable problems, and then we can start to show how they fit within the wider pattern. But portfolios work. Yeah. So I think this will not take as long as Cynefin.
Thank you. It seems like we have exhausted the number of questions.
There's a question in the chat, Morten.
Oh,
Yeah.
can you read it?
So if you want to do Swarm Compass, approach us, and we're actually supporting people on that. So our first sale, we ran that completely. That was with a big pharma. That's just completed very successfully. The second one is going to be a major bank, but the bank has got about 20 people we've trained and worked with over about 3 years. So we'll support them on that. But yeah, in fact, we probably won't let it out without support. And by the way, for those of you consultants, we're currently being very reasonable, but we see this, if a company likes it, then it will be $250,000 a year license fee to run it, right? Because it's a CEO level tool. And if you actually think about the cost equation, if I can consult networks of people from different backgrounds in real time, that's actually a lot cheaper than traditional approaches. Now, there's more stuff coming out on the organizational side on that. So we're looking at alignment without purpose or goals. And again, that's taking a biomimicry example, but adapting it for humans. So the way antelope avoid a predator is they stay together a herd, but they don't have a specific goal. That's done by micro interactions. So we're looking at alternatives to purpose statements and mission statements as well at the moment. Yeah. Johan, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry for occupying the space, but I will take the opportunity. So if we go like with business as usual, would that be in the directed way in the small?
For most companies, yes, but actually for smaller companies, it will probably be bottom right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, we can't afford to do market research.
Okay.
We have to go on my gut feel, or my gut feel as modified by the people around me. That's what small companies do. All right, that's entrepreneurial. So it's fairly easy to design profiles on this, but you can see, I mean, the Ukrainians are really interested in this because you can see how this works on battlefield strategy, and it also works on autonomy of micro command. And also on anti-corruption. We actually see the distributed decision-making resource allocation as a way of radically reducing fraud in, for example, the development sector. and of rewarding people who prove they can do things rather than people who are good at advocating that they could do something. So that's the strategy approach as well. It means people who can make things happen get real funding, whereas people who are good at saying they could make things happen have to go and do something first. That's one of the other goals here.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. So action, not advocacy, is my slogan on that one. Yeah. Any more? Cool.
Well, if not, this is an exceptional chance for me to just do a little advertising of the next events. I shall do this quickly, and you might find this interesting, Dave. I will mention just two, but we have Eva Casado, who will talk about generative strategy based on the banyan tree, if I pronounced that right. I found that quite fascinating. And then we have Steve Bunker, who just announced a new book, which is called AI and the Octopus Organization. And I think that's particularly fascinating because apparently the octopus has 9 different brains. And if it, for example, loses an arm, it can build a new arm and a new brain, and they stay connected. So looking forward to that. So we stay in the biological analogy section in some of the upcoming sections. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. I know you had a really busy day flying in and made an effort to be here, so that's really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.